Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, Tiffany Liu. And with me as always are Kensho Watanabe and William White. This week we'll be discussing the Victoires de la musique classique, basically the French classical Grammys. Then we'll review a recent online concert from the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And finally, we'll talk to historian Sally McKee about the extraordinary life and work of the Black American 19th century composer Edmond Dédé. But first, we like to start with our prelude segment. So, Will, what do we have today?
This week, we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Name That Tune, a.k.a. Stump the Hosts.
And now, Free Zone presents Name That Tune.
Music games don't come any simpler and any more intimidating than Name That Tune. And for us, this game is especially fraught because none of the three of us know what we're about to hear. That's because these Name That Tune submissions come from you, our loyal listeners. We make no guarantee that we'll be able to identify precisely what these pieces are, but we hope that hearing our thought processes will elucidate something about how we listen to music and provide some entertaining musical banter. So that none of us can see the submissions, we've once again asked our official, unofficial intern, Joseph Vaz, back on the show to help out. And we should say that Joseph is hot off the heels of his recent master's degree piano recital at CCM.
Yay! Congratulations.
Bravo, Joey, and welcome back to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here, as always. All right, our first submission comes from listener Christopher. Here it is.
I don't know. Is this kind of like this feels like nondescript dramatic music? I don't know.
Yeah,
Like,
I was
it's one
gonna,
of those
like,
things
I
where it's
almost
just
jumped in with
oh,
Hans Zimmer or
okay,
something.
cool. This could just be like I don't know, like a soundtrack to a movie with like vast landscape shots.
Yep.
So we heard a full orchestra with a strong favoring of the horn section, thick orchestration in both strings and brass. Stylistically, where did you guys put this?
I guess like early 20th century? I don't know. Maybe even later.
There was a couple crunchy harmonies in there, like one or two chords where the horns went into a note or landed on a note that was a little dissonant, and then, the strings would resolve to something to make it a little bit more consonant. And those were the moments where I was hoping that it would pivot into something a little bit more compositionally detailed, so to speak, right? But as it did leave me with this basic kind of generic movie score landscape, which doesn't help us a lot. I mean, that we can place it in the 20th century, I think, because of those harmonies is fair, but I have no idea where I'm going after that, frankly.
I don't know. I also got like a British vibe.
I had trouble with nationality on this one. This did not speak of any specific place. With the one name that I jotted down was Sibelius, but this is a little too Bruckner bro for Sibelius.
Yeah. Hey,
Right.
hey,
I mean, the
hey,
fact that
watch yourself.
The fact that the horns never give up their line, I mean, like most of the symphonic composers that are in the canon, they might have started to write something like this. Like I'm thinking Sibelius, like he has En Saga or these kinds of tone poems which land in a place for a long time and don't, innovate with the harmony that much. But there's something about how the horns sustained this big melody.
And also just the lack of like textural diversity.
Right.
It was just all kind of just blocky chords that I don't think Sibelius would write in that way. I think there would be a little bit more kind of undercurrent activity or whatever accompanying.
I think that this is like post-Sibelius, and the person who I associate with that, he's a British composer. It's like Brian. Havergal Brian. He's a 20th century symphonist So that's my best guess, Havergal Brian.
Well, I've got nothing to say after that since you just pulled that name out of thin air. So,
Tiffany, what do you think?
I'll just go with you on that
I
one.
have nothing. My closest analog to this might be something like Goretzky or something, but I'm not confident in that enough. So,
All right. This is actually from the Second Symphony of Danish composer Carl Nielsen, which is subtitled The Four Temperaments.
I think Havergal Brian was pretty close, quite honestly.
well, and you guys were spot on with the like Sibelian backdrop of this. Actually, when you guys said Sibelius, I thought about Nielsen, but I actually don't know any of Nielsen's works well enough to have put my thumb on that button.
All right. Our second submission comes from listener Satish. Here it is.
So it could either be a piece for solo violin and orchestra, or it could be kind of like a concertmaster's solo of an orchestral work.
That's my guess. I'm not sure why. Although I guess it's more to do with the fact that like there's not enough showy stuff in this violin excerpt for me to feel like that must be a concerto of some sort that I somehow missed. So I'm gonna hedge and say that it's an orchestral solo of some sort. We hear quite a lot of, it's like not quite pentatonic, but it's like, you know, it's getting to that territory.
It's like faux Debussy Ravel, like kind of impressionistic.
Right, and there's a harp in there. So I had an immediate sort of, I feel like that might be in the sound world, Friedrich Delius.
Oh.
That's interesting. Your guys' read of the harmonic landscape was a little bit different to mine because I honed in on those diminished chords, which gave it more of a 19th century. I mean, I would say like late 19th century. Actually, they were at the beginning. I thought, you know, Vuitton or somebody like that, more of an 1850s, 60s vibe. But then with all that harp, gave it a little bit more impressionist flavor. So I ended up moving my date later to maybe the 1890s. I think Delius is a pretty good guess. And English, I would agree with. I was between English and French.
It's not quite French. And also, the miking of the violin also kind of made me think that it was a solo violin. You know how it's just like, it's almost, I'm sorry, this is just like a pet peeve of mine, but when it's like a concerto and you literally hear, the recording engineer is not satisfied until they hear every single note of the solo part, even if it is part of the orchestral texture. That mic was literally inside that violin. I hate that so much.
That's a good point.
Who are some other options? Let's explore a few other options.
So here's another one where I'm not as confident, but I know Respighi wrote a number of like violin concertos that are like not really played, really long pieces that go on forever and ever and ever, like an hour long, right? Of basically like kind of nice sounding stuff. So that would be my next guess.
I like that. Yeah.
Should we just spread our guesses over the
Yeah,
two?
we should. Yeah, Kensho, take Respighi Poema Autunnale.
This is a piece that I don't know at all, but I will put my name on it, sure.
I'm going to wager Herbert Howells, who is somebody who I've talked about a fair amount on this podcast. He's an English composer, mainly of church music, but also of quasi-impressionistic, Vaughan Williams-esque, beautiful English impressionist music. So yeah. All right. So we've got a nice spread here. Shall we see if any of us got it correct?
Let's see if we hit it.
All right. Well, this is actually a violin concerto by Friedrich Delius.
Yes. All right. Tiffalalia.
Tiffany.
Very nice.
Cool. I'm gonna wear that badge for the rest of today.
All right. Our third submission of the day comes from listener me. That's right. The official intern is shooting his shot at the man today. And I remembered that you all said piano music is your downfall. So here is my submission.
feeling some strong Brahmsian vibes.
So much modal mixture, so many shifting harmonies. Definitely the end, strong Brahms. But before that, I was thinking maybe even Rachmaninoff.
I was firmly in Brahms' world, actually, until the last, 3 seconds or so. There was,
Oh my gosh, we had opposites.
Really? There was one, it was that chromatic progression that you were hearing, right? And that put you into Brahms, but it yanked me out of it. Brahms will do chromatic harmonies, but it feels like it was too kind of fully realized, the chromaticism. Like Brahms will alter it in order to kind of set up his modulation that's coming up next or something, but this was like pure chromaticism, one going down, one going up. That was what was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Maybe that would place me a little bit later.
I can't be convinced otherwise. I think I have to go with Brahms, but I'm going to be probably rudely surprised.
No, I want to pick a non-Brahms composer. I'm trying to think of who splits the difference between Brahms and Rachmaninoff. Scriabin in his early, this could be early Scriabin. Maybe that's my guess.
I think I'm going to have to stick with Brahms and just so that I feel better about the guess, because we've had Brahms so much on this show, I'm going to hazard a guess at the upper teens opus.
Upper teens or upper 100 teens?
Upper 100 teens, sorry.
All right.
No, upper 1 teens Brahms is exactly right.
Hey,
Damn, Tiffany.
This is the second intermezzo from his last set of piano pieces, Opus 119.
Damn, Tiffany, you got 2 out of 3 on this, with a high level of specificity on the third one. That's maybe the most specific we have ever gotten.
I felt like it wasn't fair to guess Brahms generically without getting more specific, because as we've mentioned, Brahms is a favorite of this podcast. So thanks for going in the direction that we thought would maybe, boondoggle us, but with music that whose language that we love.
All right, Joey, thank you so much, as always, for coming on and giving us our monthly dose of whoop-ass.
My pleasure.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment. But before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do these periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, so we invite you to try to stump us. Check out our show notes, where you will find a link to the forum where you can upload a 30-second unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Kensho, what do you have for us?
Les Victoires de la Musique Classique is an annual award ceremony held by the French Ministry of Culture, celebrating achievements in classical music. The 2021 ceremony is occurring this week, and we want to cover the nominations and discuss the differences between Les Victoires and the Grammys, which we covered a few weeks ago. A key distinction between the two awards is that Les Victoires recognizes mostly performers, orchestras, and composers, as there is a separate award for the recording industry that is called the Diapason d'Or. There are about 20 categories for Les Victoires de la Musique Classique. However, not all of them are awarded each year. There are 6 categories that are being presented this year: instrumental soloist, something called artiste lyrique, which is basically celebrating a vocalist. Then kind of a young talent version of that. So there's an instrumental soloist revelation and an artiste lyrique revelation. And 2 other categories, composer and recording. So I thought we would start off this discussion by maybe contrasting the US-based awards like the Grammys as opposed to something like this where the Victoire de la Musique is actually sponsored and run by the government. So it's kind of a different flavor to that award already, right?
There's no single award in the United States that I think is anywhere near equivalent to this. You can point to certain awards in the realm of composition, like the Grawemeyer and the Pulitzer. I don't know, for instrumentalists, there's really just competitions. I don't feel like there's one award that recognizes people for an overall achievement. So this is really unique, and that's why I think that it just shows how valued classical music is by French society and the French government in particular. And I think it's really cool that it exists.
But I'm going to slightly refine what Will just said about it being an overall achievement award. Yes, it is an award that looks at the nominees' overall careers, but before that, they're all part of a concert. Like, there is a public presentation of their performances with particular selections and so on that they all have to participate in order to win.
Right, yeah, and in that respect, it does have something to do with the Grammys in terms of like the structure of the awards show, where there are these performances. The ceremony itself is a blend between a concert and an award show, which I think I really like. I like watching the old editions.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that occurred to me as I was going through the nominees was that back when we did our Grammys segment, I was on my own kind of Googling things by these artists. And if I am not plugged into the, current of pop music and so on, then I would be basically at the mercy of algorithms, right? And here, if you package it for me and have a performance, I'm much more likely to turn it on and look at the display of talent and then make my judgments accordingly. It just seems to put everyone on a level playing field. The other thing I wanted to say is that there's nothing that more demonstrates the approaches that we as Americans have to our arts than how the Grammys are, which is that popularity and sales matter more than anything else. And the very philosophy, right, of having a state-regulated or state-curated, we'll say, slate of awards seems to speak to something about culture and art that stands independent of record sales, which I think is really laudable.
The structure of this, too, in that there is a main kind of Les Victoires de la Musique, which is more of that kind of pop music award show, which is kind of akin to the Grammys, I guess, which occurred about, I think, 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago or something like that. And then what I like about this, like you said, that it's kind of a performance based where people do show up and perform, and there's a show and a concert dedicated to the classical music part of this, is that ever since its inception, it's been a separate award ceremony performance that is not attached to the kind of more mainstream poppy show, whereas in the Grammys, it all used to be just one big long show of all of the recording stuff, right? And then now classical music and jazz has been relegated to like a pre-show that's only streamed online. It's not televised and no one really watches it.
Right. I think it takes place in like a banquet room in a hotel or something. I mean, and they've done the same thing with the Oscars too. I mean, all of the technical awards take place at a separate ceremony. And I think it's all well and good for them to be separate, but it's just a lesser than in the Grammys. Whereas here at the Victoires, it's a big celebration. It's a big concert. I mean, they get orchestras, famous conductor. I mean, Lang Lang played there in 2020. I mean, these are like the biggest names in all of classical music, and it's a huge celebration. So I think that is really cool.
So one thing that I couldn't really discern exactly through just research or reading is I feel like, I mean, at least looking at the names of people nominated this year, it seems like the people that are eligible to be awarded are people that are either French nationals or people that live in France. Did you guys also realize that too? But
that makes sense. I mean, if it's sponsored by the French government, I mean, if I were a French taxpayer, I don't know that I would want to have like a big televised concert for just any old person. But then again, like I said, Lang Lang was involved in it before, so I don't know that it is entirely.
Right.
He might have just gotten some special award because they wanted him to show up. But
yeah.
I mean, I think that it's probably either going to be French nationals or people who have gained traction in the French market, which is to say that sometimes we as Americans don't have a good idea of how other people process culture, because a lot of other international cultures are really interested in what we're doing here. And so we have the kind of privilege of being a little myopic as to how other cultures are approaching their own arts scenes. I think this is a good example of the French markets and the French audience taking primacy. And I think that one supporting statement, although Kensho, like you, I wasn't able to find the technical restriction, but one statement came from one of the instrumental nominees, and she was saying that because she had done her training in the United States, I believe it was Manhattan School of Music, she didn't expect in any way to be nominated for this award because she did not expect to gain traction in the French market.
Yeah, but as Americans, if we don't pay attention to what's going on in the classical music world outside of our own country, like we're missing 80% of what it is because, most of it is not happening here.
Yeah. Should we just quickly kind of scan over some of the nominees and talk about them?
Absolutely.
So, well, I know Will is just dying to talk about the artiste lyrique category because it contains one of his favorite artists, Léa Desandres.
Yeah, Léa Desandres. I mean, I look, hey, I tried to be fair. I listened to the other two artists here, Julie Fuchs and Véronique Jean. And if this were a normal year, I guess, I'm sure that either of them would be totally deserving winners. But I'm sorry, you can't hold a candle to Léa Desandres. She's just incredible. Yeah, I know that I've recommended several things of hers on the mixtape, so people just go find the YouTube mixtape link and be amazed. She is wonderful. What about you, Kensho? Did you have any favorite nominees in any of the categories?
Just maybe two. So the first one being in the recording category, I think I talked about Quatuor Ben before, the French quartet, and I really love them. And Beethoven Around the World, I mean, I don't know about the album itself, but I'm excited they're up there. And then I've actually worked with the guitarist Thibaut Garcia.
Have you? Oh, and, I like him a lot.
Yeah, he's a great guy. We did a Rodrigo together in Wales, of all places. So very excited for him to be nominated here.
Yeah, he would be my choice from the soliste instrumental category.
Yeah, I also enjoyed Garcia's work in that category. I think the one in which made me think about the larger picture a little bit was the category of solo instrumental révélation, which is newcoming artists on the scene. And I don't like, how big is France? Like, what is it the size of? Which state does it most come closest to approximating?
Population size or geography size?
I guess we'll say population.
I think the answer for both might be Texas.
Texas? Okay, yeah. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is I wasn't kind of blown away by the level here as in the way that I expected to be. You know, I'm in the Facebook circles where I regularly see like the posting of who won the Menuhin competition or what have you, and those are regularly jaw-dropping. And I did not have that sense watching really any of these performers, even though they were all amazing, particularly the percussion. I mean, the fact that a percussion player can get to the stage and be in a national finals for this award by doing kind of interesting but not like pop rhythms on timpani, on the side of a timpani, you know, with two mallets in one hand and like one hand tapping the side of the timpani, that was pretty interesting.
You know who I think got robbed in the Révélation Soliste Instrumentale is my boy Grégoire Blanc, the musical saw artist and theremin player who I've recommended before. I'd really like to see him in that category.
Well, I do understand that there is an audience component to some of these categories, so maybe you can send them a nice email.
So what about the composer, the composition category? Do you guys have any thoughts in there?
Well, I couldn't track down the recording of the first one that is on the list, Benjamin Attahir.
Right. So we've got Benjamin Attahir and Betsy Jolas, who's a pretty famous French composer, and Benoît Menu, who I did not know.
I actually really liked the Menu.
That was my favorite too. Yeah, that would
the cello pieces. They're actually gorgeous. I really enjoyed them.
And I got about 10 seconds into the Jolas.
Yeah, Betsy Jolas, I mean, let's be honest, that's a sound art composition.
Yes.
Sound art.
That is exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Here we go again.
But in general, for our listeners, I mean, the cool thing is you can watch the full performances of, not the compositions, but like all of these artists. Like you can come on and just like look it up on YouTube.
Yeah, there seems to be like some nationalistic pride in, you know, I think that's what I see in like looking at these revelation categories where they're celebrating their young artists and, you know, kind of getting the country to like root for these artists as they continue their career, which is something that just does not exist in this country. No. So, well, certainly should be a fun award show on this week, and I recommend people to check these artists out.
Yeah, and let us know if you have favorites.
And we'll let's hope that Léa wins, I guess.
There's no way she's not going to win. Come on. What are we even talking about here?
All right, moving on. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
On February 6th, the Los Angeles Philharmonic and Gustavo Dudamel released a special virtual concert entitled Icons on Inspiration. The star-studded program includes works by Duke Ellington, Igor Stravinsky, Gustav Mahler, Jesse Montgomery, and Arturo Marquez, interspliced with short conversations with a veritable slate of celebrities such as Katy Perry, Natalie Portman, Yuja Wang, and Julie Andrews, who speak directly to the inspirational powers of each of the specific works that they preface. The program also features the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, in addition to the wonderful soloists and members of the LA Philharmonic. Let's hear a clip.
We play specifically this symphony that we are playing today. You know, in this gala, we play this Tchaikovsky symphony.
I was listening to it again this morning while I was outside walking my dog. And I was seeing how kind of flirtatious she was with me. And it reminded me of the song, because the song starts as a flirtatious, kind of curious, like flower moment, like, do you want to play? Oh, you want to play? Let's play.
Completely. You are right, you know. This is what Tchaikovsky, I think, with the name scherzo of the piece, you know, scherzo is like playing. It's really beautiful because you really connect with the real sense, the real meaning of the music. You know, it's very beautiful. For now, we will enjoy this movement of the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony that is full of beautiful energy.
Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you.
Stay safe and inspired.
Yes.
Yes.
The whole concert lasts about 70 minutes and is still available on YouTube to stream for free. That said, it is billed especially as an online fundraising concert, and as such, generous donations go to support the LA Phil's programming and musicians during this tough time. We at the GabFest sat down to check out this digital performance and wanted to offer our thoughts for you, our listeners. Initial thoughts, guys?
Well, maybe it's just fatigue of seeing these online performance galas over the last year or so. But, I mean, I have no complaints in the artistic value of these performances, and it's certainly nice to see musicians performing and being paid to perform and doing it in a safe way, and certainly nice to see the, Hollywood Bowl. It's just nice to see. I don't know what even if, as it's empty, it's a nice scenery to kind of pair with music, and so visually it's very, very well done, I thought. So I enjoyed the concert, but I guess it's just one of those things where I'm a little bit tired. I'm over it. I want to be there. I want to be here in person. I don't want to see every wind player, encased in plexiglass.
Yeah, I'm with you there.
What I found a little disappointing, and maybe I'm skipping a few steps here, but were some of these interviews. I mean, the celebrities are kind of cool, but I felt a lot of it was just kind of empty, vapid conversation that didn't really relate to music or even art in any way, or just I wish they would go more in the relevancy or maybe the need for music or art during this time, and it didn't really seem like there was a message to any of these conversations.
I thought that was evidence just from the title of this concert, Icons on Inspiration. Like, what that is just so vague as to be totally meaningless. I had a very mixed reaction to this as well, Kensho. I mean, I think that you could say it's an interesting thing to talk about because, we called this an entry in our concert club, but it's just as much an entry in our TV club, sort of, or like our film club, because it is part concert, part these interviews. I thought the good things were, it's great to see the richest orchestra in America taking advantage of the fact that A, they have a lot of money, B, they have fantastic weather so they can, set up on outside at the Hollywood Bowl. They're very far spaced out. It's very socially distanced placement of the musicians, which allows the camera people all sorts of interesting shots and editing opportunities. I thought that the program was, by and large, good. I mean, it's certainly the programming philosophy is something that we'd like to see more of. Quite a range of voices represented in this in terms of both living and dead composers from different races and ethnicities and nationalities. And so, all that was good. But yeah, I mean, like Katy Perry talking about Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, like that she didn't even remember what it was. And like why? What? I don't know. What was that all about?
Yeah. I agree about the sort of superficial, incorporation of all these big name things, but we on the GabFest are guilty of having done more than one segment about these purported involvement of celebrities in our sphere, and it has this air of we get so excited whenever somebody who's not in our world, professes some interest or some having been touched at some point. And so that's obviously something that the LA Phil wanted to capitalize on, is any celebrity support for what the orchestra represents. And yeah, it could definitely have been better and more substantive in general, but like, do you think most people are listening to what Katy Perry is saying? They're just like looking at her and be like, oh my God, they got Katy Perry and she said she loves Dudamel. And
that's my question is, do you think that, like, what's the value add there? Because as you said in your intro, this is specifically billed as a fundraising concert, and and you have Gustavo, you have members of the orchestra, you have whoever making pitches, between every segment basically. So if you were just, regular LA rich person, I want to support the orchestra, is the fact that Natalie Portman is like talking about...
No, clearly not. They're catering to different audiences with that incorporation there. In fact, they're hoping to court new audiences. I think that's very obvious. I mean, if you are, rich person who donates to the orchestra, you're going to donate to the orchestra on seeing this gala and being involved in a gala. I'm sure they had other programming that, had those kinds of people in live. If you're going to be the kind of person that clicks the $1,000 button on the on the website, like there's going to have been other engagement opportunities that cater to that crowd. But the inclusion of Katy Perry is obviously catering towards a different audience slice. I think that's really clear.
Well, what I missed is just an actual emotional connection to classical music that I don't think any of the guests really kind of showed, right? So
That's
Katy
right.
Perry was referring to like, oh, like I was in Buenos Aires, and oh, like it was so cool that we were both there at the same time, and I was just curious to check out the LA Phil because they were there, and then I heard this piece, and like, oh, the song, by the way,
the song,
we can talk about that too. That's a whole nother segment that we should talk about, because
that was in the first lecture that I gave this semester to my music appreciation
song
kids.
Instead of piece, it is truly to grate the ears.
Well, and you know how like not hard a concept it is to explain. Songs get sung. Like, it's just so not hard.
Right.
And that, like, notwithstanding, I mean, I just felt, there wasn't really this clear thing. Like, it almost felt like, okay, it's like, please talk about this piece. And like, you can almost see it happen, because she was like, oh yeah. And then I was listening to the piece while walking my dog. And
yeah, there was clearly no rehearsal for this.
Like, clearly she was like, oh crap, like I clearly don't remember this performance, and they're asking me to talk about this piece. I might as well listen to it right before this interview so that I can talk about it.
Yeah, and it was the tail chasing the dog there, because then it was like, it took me a long time to figure out that the quote unquote thesis of this project was that the stars chose the repertoire, but then like I didn't buy it.
But not really. I mean, like,
there's no way,
Common
right?
was definitely not in on it in terms of picking Duke Ellington. He was
No,
kind of like,
I mean,
oh, okay, like that's what you're doing.
The Common segment, though, the one thing I liked about that was that it really was somebody talking about inspiration, because he was talking about Martin Luther King, and then they played a piece by Duke Ellington, which was said to be a eulogy for Martin Luther King from his suite Three Black Kings.
Mm-hmm.
That gets me back to something that I was noticing about the first two works in this, which is they obviously programmed with an ear towards diversity, and also one tiny detail that I wanted to say is that no work on this concert is more than about 7 or 8 minutes long, which is, I guess that was calculated to allow for the maximum incorporation of all these celebrity cameos and so on, and just for digital
it's
stamina.
like a gala concert, right? Like a gala concert would never have like a 20-minute
which is good.
chunk.
I think that was a smart thing, and it allowed for some extemporaneous speaking and for it to feel like a sort of casual event. So I did kind of enjoy that, and it also allowed me to pause the performance while I went and got something to eat. But the other thing I wanted to say was that the opening work of this concert, Jesse Montgomery's Starburst, and the next work, which was this Ellington, were works that I both recognized immediately without even looking. And I was happy to recognize immediately both of those works, even though I hadn't been listening particularly closely to the speech that preceded it. And it kind of addresses one of the things that I fear sometimes when I look at the mission of diversifying program, which is not knowing what's out there. I've had the privilege of supporting performances of both of those works within the last year. In fact, within the last couple months, actually. And lucky me, it's enough to hear it once to have kind of an interpretive opinion and an immediate recognition of a piece. And that was something that I was kind of immediately reassured by in some way.
Jessie Montgomery is a young African-American composer. She's been heavily featured on a lot of orchestral programming recently. The piece that was on this concert was called Starburst. It's become a pretty popular piece. I think it's great. It's for string orchestra. I really like the middle section of it in particular. It's got a lot of variety to it. It's got a lot of rhythmic energy.
I will say that I saw another orchestra perform Montgomery's Starburst recently, and I'm not a fan of this the LA Phil's performance of it.
Oh, interesting.
It's too slow.
Oh, it's too slow.
It's way too slow. It's really kind of bogged down. And what may I say before you talk about the distance of the orchestra, that the other orchestra I saw play this was also distance and in plexiglass shields and the whole bit, and it was way more verve. I think that all the excitement that is conveyed in the name of itself. I just didn't get it coming from this performance.
Well, did you also notice that like the times of day changed for each piece? So that one, I think the Starburst, I think, was recorded at night, so maybe people were just a little tired. Recording
yeah, they clearly had a few
and
different sessions to put this together.
Yeah.
Speaking to that, though, I think Gustavo Dudamel is an amazing conductor. Like, I just think that he gets so much from doing so little. I mean, when he hit the scene, he had this reputation as like a wild man. He's just like, all hair and all arms and jumping all over the place. And he can do that. I mean, he's like Leonard Bernstein in that respect. He can do that, but his basic technique is very structured and very refined. And so I think that he's a totally talented major conductor. But what was satisfying in that is I love it when great conductors and great orchestras have problems that even somebody like me could have. And where I found that was in the Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony. Did you notice that their tempo had slowed down a lot in the middle section so that when the strings came back in on the pizzicati, he really had to goose the tempo there? Maybe they even did a cut. I don't know. To me, the thing that got closest to a feeling of inspiration was when they interviewed the members of the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, Yola. And this was, Gustavo was on a Zoom call with 3 young musicians who participated in a performance of Romero's Fuga con Pajarillo, which is from his suite for strings. And then as Gustavo did with like Julie Andrews and Katy Perry, he interviewed these 3 young students, and they really had the pulse of like what it means to be inspired by this music. And to me, that was the best part in terms of like the interview segments. That was the part that really stood out to me.
Yeah. I mean, but what better way to talk to about inspiration than addressing people who are ripe for inspiration?
And they didn't have to fake this like real connection to the music or the experience of being connected to LA Phil as some of these celebrities did, because they were not force-fed lines. They're really speaking from their own experience. So obviously that came across as the strongest thing.
I don't know. What would have been a more successful styling of this concert, do you guys think? I mean, even like you said, Will, even just the title of the concert was sort of like, okay, I'm yawning already, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, if you just read it on paper, I think this concert made a lot of sense. Like you said, all the segments were, 5 to 7 minutes long. And then they had these interviews interspersed, which, I mean, like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. It just needed sharper direction somehow.
Yeah, I have a feeling that there was little to no real direction. That was my feeling watching both Gustavo and, obviously he can do it extemporaneously, whereas a lot of those celebrities couldn't or didn't,
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not deeply in touch with their mission in any way, but the only part of this show that connected this orchestra to its city was perhaps the conversation that we were just talking about with Yola. I've been kind of critical about the celebrities on the show, but I think it's great to bring them in terms of just, the attention that would grab for some listeners, but boy, I mean, especially if it's the first time this orchestra is performing online and they're coming back from COVID and they're, raising money and all this stuff, yet there's no connection to, I don't know, like community centers or hospitals or nothing, no mention about, medical workers or anything that is in recognition of what's going on in the community. I just feels like it's a little bit out of touch.
Good point. Well, the concert, listeners, is still up if you'd like to form your own opinion about it. It is a well-varied and kind of interestingly curated concert, and would love to know what you would have done had you been directing something similar, or what you would have liked to see if you are a member of the LA Philharmonic community or otherwise. With that, let's go on to our final segment of the day. Will, what do you have for us?
Edmond Dédé was a 19th century composer, conductor, and violinist whose life as an African-American expatriate making his living as a classical musician in France is one of the more unique stories in classical music history. Born in New Orleans in 1827 to a black family whose legal freedom stretched back 4 generations, Dédé's studies and career took him as far afield as Mexico City, Algiers, London, Paris, and Antwerp. The majority of his life was spent in the port city of Bordeaux in the southwest of France, where he served as music director for a number of theaters and composed everything from light popular songs to serious ballets, tone poems, and operas. Here to discuss the remarkable journey of Edmond Dédé is Sally McKee, author of The Exile's Song, Edmond Dédé and the Unfinished Revolutions of the Atlantic World, published by Yale University Press in 2016. Dr. McKee is a professor of history at UC Davis, whose work focuses on African and European Americans' engagement with intellectual and cultural movements of the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Sally, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Sally, I really enjoyed reading this book, and what I loved about it was that it was so enriched with cultural history surrounding this life, which in some ways has only sketchy documentary evidence. You know, there's not that much to go on, but you gave so much background about where Edmond Dédé came from, and I thought that we might start there. Could you tell us a little bit about the colony of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans in the early 19th century, and why that was maybe the one place where a career and a life like that of Edmond Dédé could have originated?
That's a great starting point, because let's start with his birth year of 1827. And so his great-grandparents they were freed actually in 1782-83, something like that. That was the most recent year that his family had been enslaved. And what makes that interesting is that this is a family that did marry people from outside the city, from Cuba, but they were not strictly speaking Creole in the sense that they were mixed race. Edmond Dédé came from a family that was solidly of African descent. And that mattered a lot in New Orleans because there was this bit of a dichotomy between the mixed race, more lightly complected people of color in the city and the people who were more, strictly speaking, descendants of slaves at one point and who were darker skinned. And within the city, both among white people and Black people and Creoles in the mixed race population, the Dédé family would have been probably looked down upon in a sense by all the other groups because they were so darkly complected. Now, Dédé himself grew up in a city that contained the biggest community of free people of color in the early 19th century. The only other population in the United States at that point that had nearly as large a community was Baltimore. So Dédé grew up in a city where he was surrounded by people who looked like him, but who were, let's say, on the lowest rung of the free people of color. And he was surrounded by people who were also darkly complected. And it was a strictly segregated city, but in 1827, when he was born, the real strict segregation was not quite yet in force. It wouldn't become really a very heavily, very unfriendly place to people of African descent until the late 1840s and 50s. So as he grew older, his own town became increasingly hostile to his presence and the presence of other people like him. He was further at a disadvantage because he was not legitimate. He was the child of a woman who was not married to his father. But his father did involve himself with the upbringing of Edmond Dédé and seems to have been instrumental to a certain extent in ensuring that Dédé received the beginnings of a musical education that set him up then to be able to reach out to music teachers in the city, both white and black, who then prepared him as a music student to the point where they, in effect, backed him in his ambition to go study in Paris.
So before we get too deep into his travels, I wanted to ask you about one detail that was really striking, which was you talked a little bit in the book about the Free Negro Philharmonic in New Orleans. And I think you said something like it was the largest orchestra in town. Can you give any background about that group?
So there, again, we don't know a whole lot about it because there isn't much of its records are no longer exist. But there was an orchestra made up of all sorts of people at a time when, so this would have been in the early 1840s. And the Negro Philharmonic had musicians who were Black, Creole, and white at certain points. The white musicians were probably the smallest number. The existence of the Negro Philharmonic is a testament to how accessible European music was to all demographics in New Orleans at that time. There was a market, in a sense, there was an audience, a demand for European music in New Orleans among the free people of color, and also among some of the slaves, because there are references to, for instance, the opera house, the French opera house, and other smaller musical enterprises in the city where slaves were sneaking in and going up to the top seats. And so they were trying to police that a bit, but at a certain point, I think they just said, oh, whatever.
So it sounds like, Edmond Dédé was in the perfect place as well in terms of becoming inspired to become a musician, because obviously that wasn't something like, as you write, it's not something that was very common for someone to leave the country and go and further their studies in music. So could you talk to us a little bit about how he gets to France and some of his earlier experiences in terms of his studies and how he then became a music director in Bordeaux, of all places?
Sure. Now, it wasn't entirely unusual for people in New Orleans to go to Paris to study. After all, New Orleans is a Francophone city, or was a Francophone city, both Creole white and Creole black. But let's use Creole to describe the mixed race and Black people in the city. So there were a few people, including one or two Creoles of color, mixed race people, men mainly, who had gone to Paris to study music. Dédé had two teachers, one of whom really is the important one. He was an Italian immigrant who came to New Orleans. He seemingly, apparently wrote a letter of introduction for Dédé. Now, as I explain in the book, that was a problem in some sense. Dédé could not have really had an expectation, unless he was really out of touch, or including his teachers out of touch, with the Conservatory of Music in Paris, because he was too old.
Right. I thought that was interesting too, is that in this country, the thing that would have kept him from getting into a conservatory was his race. But in France, it was actually just his age. They were happy to have Black people as students at the conservatory. Is that right?
Exactly. They had no problem with that. The difference between France and the United States with regard to people of color is that it was the United States that had the restrictive laws. France didn't really have those restrictive laws, but both places, both the United States and France, were not all that welcoming of Black people. But there was no structural legal framework for expressing that dislike of people of color in France, because French people were ambivalent about slavery, but they didn't actually live with the people that French authorities enslaved. People in the US did.
Mm-hmm.
And so they set up much more legal divisions to separate the people that they were having to live with. So in France, Dédé actually encounters quite a bit of racism, but he's not kept out of institutions. He's not told to sit separately. There's no formal mechanism for segregation in France. And when he went to France, he knew or found out right away that he wasn't going to be able to matriculate in and enroll in the conservatory because he was too old. So he shaves off a couple of years, off of his age. He manipulates his passport to make it seem that he's younger. And, who's going to know? Because, the technology of public documents at that time made it pretty easy to do that. So he goes to Antwerp just to spend some time and make some money with some people from back home. And then he returns to Paris after a certain amount of time so that he can begin taking lessons from the faculty at the conservatory.
Right, from Halévy, if I remember correctly, right? The composer of La Juive.
And that was pretty impressive. I mean, to be a private student of Halévy must have been, it gives you an idea of what people thought about his playing, because he was taking lessons in violin at that point. And he worked around in Normandy and Rouen, and then he went to Angers, and then he went, a couple of other places before he got a job as the assistant conductor at the Grand Théâtre in Bordeaux, the Grand Theater, where he was in charge of rehearsing the ballet corps. And we know from a pretty early point that when he got there, which is probably around 1860, that he was already he was composing pieces for the ballet. There were ballets that were part of operas, and he would compose the music for those like one-act little dances in the middle of an opera.
So as a lot of composing happens, it's sort of like on a need-to basis. He found himself in this conducting job, and then he segued into writing music that was for functions in this ballet company.
That's right. And so, but you can tell that he does have aspirations to compose longer and bigger pieces. The National Library of France has a big collection of his sheet music, and there's nothing like symphonies in there, although there are orchestral pieces that are shorter.
Right.
But nothing, the opera, which is kind of the mystery at the heart of the book in some ways, finding that manuscript, that was like the longest piece that I ever saw among all the sheet music that he produced. Everything up to that point were all these short pieces and then songs for the music halls he later worked for.
Just to bring in my co-host here a little bit, I'll admit that I did not hear of Édmond Dédé until he turned up in a segment that we did a couple months ago. It was about this whole concept of full naming composers. We all thought they were sort of silly, but Dédé was mentioned in there, and I had never heard of him. But we were reading that, and I mentioned it to Tiffany and Kensho here, and they had both had experience. So Tiffany, we're just referring now to this opera that Dédé wrote, which, Sally, if I understand correctly, this is the opera Margiane ou le Sultan du Safa, which is perhaps the earliest surviving opera by a Black person from 1887. And Tiffany, you participated in a performance of the overture of this piece, is that correct?
So I had the fortune to work with Richard Rosenberg, and I was in the premiere performance of the overture that was performed in Floyd, Virginia at the National Music Festivals in its inaugural season in 2011. And so I wanted to ask about that grand mystery, because of course I was pretty young at the time, so all I remember from that experience was, oh yeah, this is kind of an interesting work whose origins and whose destiny were not really realized, and which we are shrouded in this kind of mystique. So I want to hear more about this piece that I've apparently have premiered.
To me, the importance of the piece is that even though I learned a few years later that there was a previous opera by an African American in Europe who had composed an opera, but that did not exist. And if it ever existed, but there was apparently some previous thing. But Dédé's opera is unique in that it predates, Tremonisha by at least 25 years. Mm-hmm. And it is, as I explain in the book, as hokey as any other opera, plot that you could think of. But it has many different features in it that are worth reflecting on for a working composer at that time, because Edmond Dédé is in the position of having to compose music for a libretto that valorizes, at one point in an aria, white skin, and I just wonder, how did he feel about that? Writing a piece in which the Sultan is talking about the alabaster skin or something like that.
And of course, it's interesting that it's a sultan talking about this too, because then this brings in this whole vague of exoticism, which was so popular in France in the late 19th century, even into the 20th.
That's right. In that sense, he's clearly responding to what he thinks of as a demand. On the one hand, let's put this in a little bit in some chronological order. So he couldn't go on really working as an assistant conductor at the Grand Theater, mainly because of money. So he switches to the popular music mode. He begins as musical director of some of the big music halls in Bordeaux, the old Café Concert, the precursors like the English music hall more than our vaudeville. But they were big spectacular shows, and people would come and eat and drink, but mainly drink at these performances. And they were right in the heart of the center of Bordeaux, and they were very popular. And that's the venue that he wrote most of his songs and pieces for. So the existence of the opera shows that he was aware of the dichotomy between serious art music and popular music. And he was more concerned with his own, sense of self, of wanting to be taken seriously as an art music composer. And that was his life goal. And that's why he probably composed Mon Chien over a decade.
And it was thought for a very long time that the opera hadn't been finished, right? Up until fairly recently.
That's right. But it was,
right.
In fact. And it's long, and it would have been really expensive to produce because it's got crowd scenes, it's got Sultan's Palace as the background and all that. And it's got a ballet, of course. And he did finish it, but he never got it produced.
So I'm like Tiffany, have had some experience performing Dédé, but actually what's funny is that I performed a piece called En Chasse. And so you're familiar with the story in that, I thought it was Edmond Dédé at first, but actually the piece itself was a piano piece written by his son, Eugène Dédé. And so you were speaking on, the initial kind of inspiration for Edmond being his father, who was encouraging his musical studies. So can you talk a little bit about how he then also passed that on to his son, or how involved was Eugène in music, and did he end up composing a lot more, or what is the story there?
Well, in 1867, Eugène Arcade was born in Bordeaux. And Edmond Dédé had married just a couple of years before a young woman of French ancestry, an illegitimate woman who was a seamstress. Edmond raised his son to work with him. And Eugène, as far as I can tell, never aspired to compose art music. By the time that he was of age to help his father, Edmond Dédé had long been working in the music halls. And so that's basically what Eugène was trained for. Eventually, he moved to Paris and began working at a theater in the Gaîté Montparnasse, which was one of the main music halls in Paris, and acquired apparently a quite good reputation as not just a lyricist, but he also, as a songwriter. And he made a living at it. So when Edmond Dédé and his wife finally retire, which was around 1890, they moved to Paris to be with their son. And their son was employed throughout his life by the music hall. And he married a woman who was a Hungarian Jew. And her parents were back in Budapest, but they married and had kids. Now, this is the part where you guys wouldn't even be aware of this. Last year, I was in Paris and was at the City Archives, and I found something that I was not prepared for, which was that I thought that Eugène's 2 children had died without children. But while I was in Paris last year, I found out that Eugène had remarried after the death of his first wife, and he had had 2 or 3 children who went on to have kids and lived. So there are direct descendants of Edmond Dédé somewhere in France, but because of the nature of the civil law, I can't access the public documents yet. And so everybody thinks that Edmond Dédé doesn't have any surviving descendants, and it turns out he looks like he does.
Oh my gosh, wow. This is a scoop, exclusive for the Classical Gabfest. Oh my gosh. If any of our French listeners, this has been a very Francophile episode. We've done some other segments on the show that are very French leaning, but so if any of our French listeners are potentially descendants of Edmond Dédé, please write in. But Tiffany,
and
I know
Will will give you my address.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll put you in touch. Well, I don't know if the answer to this question is related to, the existence of direct descendants of Edmond Dédé, but how do we perform his music more? Is there a publishing, something or other in the works, and why not? The time would seem to be right.
Have you heard of an opera company in New Orleans called Opera Creole?
No.
They specialize in the music of Creoles of color all throughout the 19th and 20th century. They are a small, seriously underfunded outfit. The founder and the director of it are on the faculty at Loyola, which is right next to Tulane. Their big dream is to mount a production, or at least a concert form of Molière, which
awesome.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're going to be able to do it just because of the funding situation and all the problems and so forth. But I wish them luck, because I wish they would. That's why I've been so anxious to shine a bit of light on this, because this is a big part of U.S. history. And I think the fact that Dédé spent 36, 37 years overseas has, let's say, muddied the waters a little bit, in the sense that people don't think of him as necessarily an American composer. But he thought about the United States, his family, and the struggles going on in the United States his whole life. The fact that he came back in 1893 is indicative of how his mind and his heart was always looking towards home. It's just that there was no place for him at home, even after Reconstruction, collapsed. And in the period, he couldn't come back again for good. So we need more people to pay attention to him.
Absolutely. And for that reason, Sally, we're so glad that you came on the show to talk about Edmond Dédé today. And I just have to say a couple of things before we wrap here. One is that I will confess that when we have authors on the show, what I usually do is download the sample chapter onto my Kindle and read that, and then I've read the introduction, and that's like enough to get by. With your book, I did that, and I could not put down the book. I had to get the book and read it to the very end because, and we haven't talked about this, and I don't want to spoil it, the book starts with an episode that's basically like the Titanic. I mean, it is an adventure story on the high seas, and it is so exciting, and it sort of sets up a mystery that is answered or hypothesized about at the end of the book. So I don't want to say anything more about that, but it's just a really gripping beginning, and it's such a well-written book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So I do hope that our listeners will check it out. But before we do let you go here, Sally, the last thing we like to do is to have our guests recommend something for our classical mixtape. Would you be down to do that?
I would.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Sally, what would you like to share with our listeners?
I think it would be a great idea if you want to understand Dédé's trajectory, to start by looking at what he listened to. So I would say start with Halévy.
La grâce tutélaire à mes tremblantes mains confie à ton berceau. J'aurais à ton bonheur voué ma vie entière. Et c'est moi qui te livre au bourreau. J'avais à ton bonheur voué ma vie.
And that was Rachel Quand, seigneur from Halévy's La Juive. Thank you for that recommendation, Sally. Tiffany, what you got?
I have a new version of an old piece. This is Couperin's Les Barricades Mystérieuses, played on the marimba by the percussionist who is in the finals of Les Victoires de la Musique, Aurélien Genieux. And this is him playing the marimba.
I have played this piece many times, including for a friend's wedding in Hawaii as the bridal entrance music. It was
on marimba?
No, I played it on the electric keyboard. We were outside, and there was an amp, and it was a lot of fun. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece.
Could have next time you play it for a wedding, you can set the keyboard to the marimba.
That is right. Yeah, I could have played it on the marimba.
Okay, William, what do you have for us?
All right, well, this particular piece I have chosen for a number of reasons, and I'm going to try to get through all of them really quickly. Number one of the interesting items from the Los Angeles Philharmonic concert that we watched was the final piece was the finale of Mahler's Fourth Symphony in a chamber orchestra arrangement, which included not only piano, but also the harmonium, which is like a little foot pump organ. And it crops up here and there in the world of classical music, but there is one piece that is written for both piano and harmonium and choir, or a small selection of voices. And this is the Kyrie from the Petite Messe Solennelle by Gioacchino Rossini. Now, I chose this particular recording, which is by the Netherlands Chamber Choir. I'll even give that a shot. The Nederlands Kamerkoor, as conducted by Manoj Kamps, who is a Sri Lankan Dutch conductor. What I like about this recording in particular is that it is the one recording where you can really hear the harmonium. Now, I've known this piece for a while. It's one of my favorites because it is featured on the soundtrack of one of my favorite movies, La Mala Educación of Pedro Almodóvar.
Very cool. And in celebration of our wonderful chat with Sally McKee on Edmond Dédé, I was struck by something that Sally said that, despite him having spent over 3 decades overseas, that his mind was always back at home in the United States. So I picked a piece entitled Chicago, Grande valse à l'américaine. And this is performed by the Hot Springs Music Festival Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Richard Rosenberg, who we also mentioned in the interview earlier.
It's like Johann Strauss almost. This is delightful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very Straussian.
You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm Tiffany Liu, and on behalf of Kensho Watanabe and William White, I'd like to thank you so much for listening, and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on Apple Podcasts. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week. I'm seriously so mad at myself. I really was going to say Nielsen for the first
You
time.
would have been 3 for 3.
I really, really was.